The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. Because every book in our store is signed, our Wall of Fame displays a breathtaking array of writers and signatures. Close-up shots reveal giants of literature, acclaimed historians, stars of stage and screen, our nation's leaders, famous sports heroes, and thousands of other esteemed authors. Today's Wall of Fame guest is Jeff Gold, joining us from his home in California to talk about his new book, Sittin. And here is Jeff Gold with our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome. We are delighted and honored to be joined today by Jeff Gold from his home in California. Jeff, how you doing?
Excellent, Jake. How about you?
Oh, thanks so much. It's just great to chat with you. While we're sitting in, I want to take a few minutes to tell our audience why we are both delighted and honored to visit with Jeff Gold. This guy is America's real music man. As art director and producer, he's worked with the biggest names in the business, and we're talking about Cat Stevens, the Neville Brothers, Miles Davis, Jimi Hendrix, and on and on. He is also an Emmy winner. He is
Grammy winner.
Grammy. Thank you. I've got written down Grammy and said Emmy. I meant Grammy. Thanks so much. Misspoke. He is one of America's most knowledgeable and respected music historians, and is frequently asked to consult on big time projects. His new book, Sittin, Jazz Clubs of the 1940s and 50s, will be treasured by fans of all genres, but it is a must-have for jazz aficionados. Jeff, if you will please share the genesis of Sittin with our audience.
Well, it's a crazy story. I had written a couple of books before about music topics and had sworn off doing it again. Too much work. And in my business, buying and selling music collectibles, I stumbled upon a collection of jazz memorabilia and these photographs from jazz clubs. Let me show you one. Since we can cut. Hang on a second. I'm sorry to do this, but
no, I love it.
So I stumbled upon what has to be the world's biggest collection of jazz club memorabilia. And in that collection were nearly a couple hundred of these, which are souvenir photos that were taken at jazz clubs in the 40s and 50s. And people who were at clubs, the club would have an in-house photographer and go around snapping people at their tables, go in the back room, develop them, and have a print in a custom folder available for $1 at the end of the evening as a souvenir. And I'd never seen any of these from jazz clubs. I'd seen them from the Coconut Grove or nightclubs, but never from jazz clubs particularly. And this person had, over 30 years, amassed a big collection of them. And I thought, God, as I was looking through them, I thought, this is a book. I've never seen any of these, and I doubt anybody else has seen a large collection of them since I've been in this business a long time. So I came home and was just staring at these, having this internal dialogue of, I know I said I'd never do another book again, but God, these things are so incredible. Started doing some research, found out that there really were no books on jazz clubs, and there were no collections online or off of these photographs. And eventually they kind of stared me down. And I decided that it was important for history's sake to try and put together a book of these. And since I wasn't in jazz clubs in the 40s and 50s, and I know a lot about jazz, but I wasn't an expert on jazz clubs at the time. I decided I wanted to speak to some people who were. So I made a list of musicians who were alive and playing clubs in the late 40s. And to do that, you've got to be at your late 80s or 90s. And at the top of that list was Quincy Jones, who started off as a trumpeter in Seattle, first playing clubs and then moving to Boston and then New York. And because I'd been in the music business and I had some mutual friends of his, I was able to score an interview with him. And from there, I was able to interview Sonny Rollins, the most famous jazz musician alive. And they told me their great tales about playing in these clubs. And it went from there.
Boy, it sure did. It went from there is so true. We're fascinated. We understand that most of the photographs that we've seen are in fact patrons rather than performers. And while this is not a history of jazz, it's an amazing look at the jazz clubs and many of these never before seen pictures.
Extraordinary. Sorry to interrupt, but it was kind of extraordinary.
Sure, please.
When I was looking at these, I was thinking, I've seen pictures of Birdland or some of these more famous clubs, but it's always from outdoors where somebody's photographing the marquee or the doorman standing outside, or else the performers on stage. And you never see the interiors of the clubs, and you never see the patrons. And there's a collection at the Library of Congress of William Gottlieb, who was one of the most famous photographers from that era, shooting jazz. And there's 1,600 photographs in the Library of Congress, and maybe 1 or 2% of them show audience members. So it really got me thinking that these photographs kind of turn the camera around and focus on who's in the club and what the artists are seeing from the stage.
It's a fascinating picture. There are a couple of these I would ask you about and appreciate you sure. Sharing. I consider this, besides a look at jazz, it's almost a captivating image of America 70, 80 years ago, with a focus on maybe race that we'll get to in just a minute. There's a picture right at the beginning that I just love. It's a young white couple in the 40s with a smiling Charlie Parker looking on. Tell us what you can about that.
I will. Let me shut the door first. Okay. Okay. So that Charlie Parker, let me start over since I was sliding. That Charlie Parker photo is my favorite photo in the book. Oh. And taken at the Royal Roost in 19...
I promise we didn't plan this.
There you go. Taken at the Royal Roost, a club in New York in 1948. And it shows this beautiful young couple posing with Charlie Parker, and clearly they're just enraptured to be photographed with him. And that was something that happened in these clubs. People would ask the performers while they were off stage or taking a break if they could get a photo with them. And it's kind of the primordial version of the celebrity selfie today. And I can't think of any context where people would get their picture taken with celebrities on a regular basis prior to this. But it kind of demonstrates this through line through the book, which is an exploration of how these clubs were, if not the earliest, some of the very earliest places that blacks and white people could commingle safely during the Jim Crow era. And that's something that I explored deeply in my interviews with Sonny Rollins and Quincy Jones. And Sonny went on at length about how jazz never gets credit for being one of the first integrated scenes, and how in these clubs, race didn't matter. Black people, white people in the audiences, black musicians and white musicians on stage. In Harlem as early as the late 1920s, but really in the 40s and 50s, These were extraordinary kind of oases from racism. And outside of the clubs, not so much so, but inside of the clubs, very much so.
Which is a great segue to another favorite photo of mine in the book, the 1937 New Year's Eve celebration at the famous Cotton Club with band leader Cab Calloway. And I looked at the audience, and would you expand on that picture, please?
Cotton Club is a really interesting example. If you look at that photograph, you see that the only person of color in it is Cab Calloway. It was the biggest and first big club in Harlem to showcase jazz, and it was strictly segregated. So they had entirely black entertainers. It was a review kind of show with a jazz band, dancers, singers, comedians, and the audience was only white. They didn't allow black people in. You could be on stage, but you couldn't be in the audience. And we go into that club in depth in the book. It's an interesting phenomenon because while it was segregated and had racist graphic design in their menus and posters, and we reproduced some of that stuff, it was very valuable to some black musicians and performers to play there. They paid them very well, and they had a national radio wire in the early days of radio. So people like Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, who played there at the beginnings of their career, benefited greatly from national exposure via radio and were able to get lucrative record deals and tour the country because they played the Cotton Club and they were featured on these radio broadcasts every week. So somebody like Sonny Rollins, who grew up in Harlem, said, look, I don't see any good in that. They were just, the owners of the club were just trying to make money. They didn't care about black music. They just saw it as a good vehicle to make money. And certainly that's true. But Dan Morgenstern, who I also interviewed, who's the foremost jazz historian in the world, and spoke to many musicians who played there, said, you know, it wasn't all bad because they did make a lot of money and they did get national exposure and they did get record deals and they could tour other places with much more liberal and integrated audiences. So it's a nuanced situation. Happily, that club was very much the exception to the rule, and almost all the clubs in Harlem at the time were integrated. The Cotton Club closed by the late 30s, and by the time you get to the 40s and 50s, it's a very integrated scene.
And that clubs like Birdland and the Apollo, they were fully integrated?
Very much so, yeah. Birdland was run by a guy named Morris Levy, who allegedly was a mob-connected music business guy, but he very much believed in equal rights and was a great fan of African-American music and African-American culture, and made sure his club was completely integrated. And there were clubs like Cafe Society, which opened in the late 30s in Greenwich Village, that the guy who opened it was a shoe salesman from New Jersey who had gone to Vienna and seen cabarets and decided he wanted to open one in America. And came back, hired Billie Holiday to open his club, and he actually gave preferential treatment to African-American people because he was such a big fan of African-American culture and music.
Well, I'll really show my age. I have been to Cafe Society. I noticed
at the very tail end, I'm sure.
The very tail end, just recently. Quite a few of the photographs in your awesome book include soldiers and sailors. Did the clubs solicit servicemen, or did these guys just happen to attend like the public happened to attend?
I think a lot of those photographs were taken during and just after World War II. And when the service people would get furloughs to be able to, have a few days off, a lot of them headed to jazz clubs. And so you see even photographs like this. You see the V sign. So
Yeah.
buy war bonds and stamps. So this is
Yeah.
clearly taken during World War II. And a lot of the photographs with service people seem to be taken during that era. So I think it was a combination of service members looking to blow off steam, jazz being very popular, and these clubs being very hip spots, and the great music.
Well, the photographs are stunning, fascinating, and mesmerizing, and I don't think a day has gone by since I've had the advanced copy that I haven't looked through the book and enjoyed the photographs. However, the sidebars of all the entertainers with whom you spoke also were riveting. Take each one. Would you take just a minute and talk about your conversation, say, with Quincy Jones?
Sure. As I said before, I felt it was important as a white guy who wasn't around in this era to speak with, and so much of the culture represented in the books and the photographs are of African Americans. I felt like it was really important to talk to people who were there or who were experts on the subject. So I spoke with Quincy first, and this racial aspect of it hasn't really been explored in depth in books. And I wasn't aware that these places were such a refuge, early refuge from racism. So I kind of offhandedly said to Quincy, what was the racial scene like there? And he said, it was paradise, essentially. Racism would have been over in the 50s if people paid attention to the jazz musicians. Nobody cared about whether you were black or white. On the bandstand, it was all about how you could play. And that really kind of surprised me. And so when I spoke to Sonny Rollins, I asked him, and he really let loose on this subject, talked about how jazz musicians don't get credit for the important role they played in integration, and how he'd grown up in Harlem, so he hadn't had a lot of experience with interacting with white people, and he would go to these clubs like Birdland, and people would come up to him and ask him for his autograph and tell him how fantastic he was and ask him for a photograph, if they could take their photograph with him, and it kind of blew him away and really made him feel very special. And he really felt like this is kind of a buried story. And after about a 10 or 15 minute discussion of it, he goes, I hope you put this in your book. We never get credit for this. And I said, of course. So then I thought it would be interesting to speak to someone who was in the audience at the clubs at the time. And Dan Morgenstern, who's 90, came as a refugee from Nazi Germany in 1947 as a 17-year-old. And he was a jazz fanatic and immediately started going to these clubs. And he told me great stories about being broke and trying to sneak in. He was underage and broke. And the musicians would say to him things like, when you go to the bar, don't order a mixed drink because it'll come in a clear glass and the bartender will see how fast you finish it and then start pressuring you to order again. Order a beer because it comes in an opaque bottle and they won't be able to track how quickly or slowly you're drinking.
Oh, man.
And, I was able to ask him about whether he could just walk up to musicians and start talking to them. And he said, yeah, absolutely. And the fact that he was European was interesting to them. And he befriended some musicians and started going to Harlem. And it was really interesting to talk to him about the race aspect, being a white guy who was at these clubs. And he said, yeah, what Sonny and Quincy had told me was true. And occasionally in New York, when he and some friends were feeling tipsy, maybe he and an interracial couple would go to a restaurant that they knew wouldn't seat them, was segregated. And though segregation was illegal, they'd say things like, oh, we don't have room. Sorry. And Dan said, you'd point to a table and go, that table's empty. Oh, that's reserved. And they knew fully what they were doing. They were just trying to give the people a hard time. And interestingly, this 17-year-old kid who was obsessed by jazz and hit New York and started going to these clubs became the foremost historian in the world on the subject of jazz and ran the Rutgers Jazz Institute for nearly 30 years. And so it was great to get his perspective from the audience. Then I wanted to speak to a young musician who had a view toward history. Jason Moran is a MacArthur Genius Grant winning pianist and composer, and he's the creative director for jazz at the Kennedy Center. And we had a mutual friend, so I sat down with him. And he was amazed. He had literally never seen one of these photographs and didn't even know they existed. And we got into a really wide-ranging discussion, not just about race and music and history, but about how important it is to document the audience. And he had never really realized that until looking at these things. And it really sent him off on a really extraordinary conversation where he explored the meaning of Black culture and what these photographs show that you can't see elsewhere.
I believe many of your readers are going to find much that neither you nor I were expecting them to see. It's a fascinating look at our country and music and race and so much. It ought to be the number one gift in America for music fans. And we're so appreciative of your taking time to tell us about it, visit with us in person, and for citing that mountain of book plates. I hope your hand recuperates.
You know, as I told you, I love your business model. And when I agreed to do this, I looked at your website and ended up buying 2 books. I think it's fantastic what you're doing.
What a nice way to end an interview.
You know, Jake, I'm going to send you a playlist that people who are interested in this book and this era can listen to on Spotify or Apple Music that was curated as kind of a soundtrack to the book.
What a great idea. That's awesome. Jeff, thank you. And folks who want to buy this incredible book for themselves, for their library, for gifts, go to alabamabooksmith.com.
To listen to the playlist for Sittin' In, click on the link in the description below.